This is episode 282 of the Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts podcast. This episode is titled South of the Yangtze with Flora Qian. Welcome to Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts. I'm your host, Jennifer Crittenden. Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts is brought to you by The Discreet Guide, the coaching and training company for improving your speaking and writing skills, with a special focus on mastering English and advancing your career. Let's get you to where you want to go. On with the show, and thank you for joining me today. I'm so pleased to welcome a new guest to the show today. I have Flora Qian with me. So welcome to the show, Flora.
Thanks for having me, Jennifer.
Flora is here today with her new novel, South of the Yangtze. And I'll give you a little background on her. She was born and raised in Shanghai. She left her home in her early 20s and has spent most of her time since then in Hong Kong. She has also lived in Washington, D.C. and Singapore. Her short fiction has appeared in the Asia Literary Review, East Lit, and some anthologies. She's a graduate of Fudan University in Shanghai. She has an MFA in creative writing from the University of Maryland and an MA in translation from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And South of the Yangtze is her first novel. I really enjoyed reading this book very much, and I'm anxious to get the episode out because I think this could make a nice holiday gift for someone. So I'm hoping that we can release the episode in time for people to give it as a gift. Yeah, very interesting novel, not unlike many of the novels that I encounter. I read a lot, and this one definitely stood out. So when it crossed my desk, I was excited to talk to you about it. It's a coming-of-age novel, and so I wanted to ask you about why you wanted to write that kind of book.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for your introduction. I think the story has been with me for a long time. I grew up in the 1980s in Shanghai, and this novel is definitely inspired by my upbringing growing up in that era. So I was part of this one-of-a-kind only child generation. In the 1980s, it was a very strange time in China because the country has just recovered from the traumatic Cultural Revolution, which ended in 1976, only a few years after I was born. My parents were very busy at the time. They lost so much educational opportunities during the Cultural Revolution. My father never went to university at the time, so he went straight to graduate school in the 1980s. And my mother was studying for her university degree at the same time on top of her day job. So they were busy, and my father was a university professor, so I grew up always surrounded by books. Mm-hmm. So in those kind of loneliness as an only child, I turned a lot to reading and writing. So I think that sort of inspired me to become a writer myself because I was revelated when I found that I can talk to people in time and space. I was now no longer restrained by my small circle. So I want to be that kind of person that someday other people will find themselves resonating with in their own loneliness. Yeah, so the story has always been there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely created a love of books and of sharing stories, which definitely comes across quite a bit in the novel. Mm-hmm. Also, it is a novel. You describe it that way, and yet I keep getting a little bit confused between what is your story and what is your protagonist's story. Did you think about writing it as a memoir?
Not really. I never thought of it as a memoir. I think, it is because I did choose to write in first person because I want that kind of intimacy and, the poignancy in a coming of age story. Mm-hmm. But I think for me, the difference is that in fiction, it is the emotional truth that is more important than the factual accuracy.
Oh.
So, for example, the grandfather character in my novel is a combination of both my maternal and paternal grandparents, and
Oh, I
also one
see.
of the right, and another person. So it's a mix of characters. But I think my emotion for my grandparents is there in the
Hmm.
book, and so is my emotion for that generation in general.
Hmm.
So I think that is what I talk about emotional truth. But a more important question there is the authorial distance. So where does the author stands in terms of time, and what kind of level of self-awareness does the author have about the meaning of these events?
Hmm.
So I think for me, the narrator is definitely older. She's in her mid 30s. So she is looking back in terms of time
Yeah.
at her old world and old experiences. But on the other hand, she is awakening to herself
Hmm.
for the first time. And she is transforming as she is narrating the story.
Absolutely.
I think that is what's so special to me about coming of age story, because that emotional distance is so close.
Yeah, it's definitely an appeal of the novel is that we do see this young woman. Well, it opens when she's really a child, and not only do you see her transformation over the next, couple of decades, but you also see her surroundings change so much. And, that was very interesting to me. I don't know a lot about Chinese history. And I thought it was really clever way to show these two things sort of changing at once, these two bodies, the girl, and then also the environment that she finds herself in really being, transformed
Mhm.
across these couple of decades. So that was really interesting to me. I did want to ask you about the title. I didn't include that question in my
Mm.
list, but I wondered if there was significance to this idea of south of the Yangtze. Is that a particular area or why you chose that title?
So for me, south of the Yangtze, which is the south of the Yangtze Delta, at the end of the Yangtze River. So the major city in that area is Shanghai, but
Okay.
that area also includes a few neighboring provinces, Jiangsu and Zhejiang provinces. So that area has a lot of emotional significance to me. So I started writing the first draft of the novel in 2018 when I moved back to Hong Kong for the second time. So I left home in my early 20s. I lived in Hong Kong for many years, on and off for over a decade. But in 2018, I moved back again and I took a trip with my husband. So he is from the US. And at the time, we were only married for a year. And that trip led us to my grandparents' ancestral village
Yeah.
in Zhejiang province, which is a part of the Yangtze Delta area. And that trip reminded me a lot of the cultural heritage in that area, a classic literature, calligraphy, green tea, and silk and rice wine, all these good things in Chinese culture. And I was once so familiar with. I realized my family has deep roots in that area. So my last name Qian, it's a very popular, big last name specific to that area.
Oh.
So in Zhejiang province, there is a river called Qian River,
Oh.
and right, and there's even temples honoring this Qian king who once ruled the area 1,000 years ago. So I realized that, my family, they stuck around, they never left, but I
Mm.
was the one who made the decision to migrate. Of course, there's a lot of freedom brought by migration, but there is also a lot of unresolved feeling for me,
Mm. Mhm.
lot of nostalgia. So I think I started this novel as a way to untangle these thoughts and
Right.
resolve those feelings in the first place. Yeah. So the place is definitely very important in a novel, I would say.
Right. Yeah, it's so interesting, and that your experience is mirrored in the novel with that initial train ride where the protagonist is riding on the train through this area. Very different kind of train now, but
Hmm.
similar to a trip that she took when she was young. And so you recount the train ride through the eyes of this little girl when she first made that big trip by herself.
Hmm.
And I'm sorry to do this to you, but I'm going to read a little bit of your own book to you because there are a couple of things that happen or that you recount in that train ride that I thought were so interesting. So here's a little excerpt from that part of the book. The smell in the car was a mix of sweat and the delicious cooked food people had packed to save money. I'd heard from my parents that during the long haul train rides in those days, people made friends. Some youngsters found their partner, such as the well known 1980s poet Gu Chen, who later murdered his wife, whom he had met on a train ride and committed suicide afterwards. And this little excerpt comes very early in the book. And so I pulled this out because of the surprise that they're in there, right? That we
Hmm.
don't anticipate that suddenly we're going to be hearing about a murder suicide. And it's a little bit typical of the book that there are often, to an American reader, some unusual juxtapositions of things like
Hmm.
that, this sort of idyllic, through the eyes of a child, but oh, actually, yeah, this is what happened with this poet, right? And so I wondered if you felt as though that was easy or that kind of surprise, that it captures the reader, right? I mean, it keeps
Hmm.
us reading because we can't predict what's going to happen next. And it's enjoyable. The writing is very enjoyable and interesting. And so I wondered if you felt as though that it was easier to execute that kind of little surprise for a reader, or a little gift for the reader when you were talking about a culture that's so different from
Hmm.
American culture.
Right. Well, I think at the time of writing, I wasn't thinking too much about it.
Hmm.
I think you actually reminded me I didn't explain too much in that part. So, Gu Chen is a poet, so very famous in China at the time, not only about the murder suicide, but he actually has really wonderful poems. So I think the most famous poem is called A Generation.
Hmm.
It only has one line. It says, the night gives me black, dark eyes, but I use those eyes to seek light.
Hmm.
I don't know if my translation did it justice, but that was a famous poem.
Hmm.
I don't know why. When I was writing it, I was keep thinking about this poet who was considered one of the romantic school at the time, and it he influenced my parents' generation so much. I think I didn't explain that particular part. I was hoping that my readers, if they're interested in it, and if they want to move a little bit closer to the protagonist, these cultural references will inspire them to do some research. I think this is a challenge of very fine balance, I find, when I write in English. Too much explanation will, of course, interrupt the flow of the book. And I think, some writers like Junot Diaz, he choose to not to explain too much and ask the readers to move a little bit closer to the narrator.
Hmm.
I think my approach in this book is, in comparison, still quite traditional. I think most of the times I will, translate the Chinese character and also give a little bit background for the readers. So the events are not entirely out of context, right? Yeah, I think the poem I mentioned there was a little bit of detour I made in my own mind at the time. It wasn't central to the development of the plot, but yeah, I think if a reader is interested to know a little bit, that would definitely help them understand, the time, the 1980s, a
Hmm.
lot better.
Hmm. No, I think it's done really effectively. Yeah, I definitely never felt as though it was too much. But it's effective, right? It gives you a sense of what's important in the culture and what is influencing this little girl. So yeah, I thought it was done quite well. Although there's a lot of it that I didn't understand, right? There's that I felt as though
Mhm.
there's a lot more that I could learn about by going into that. Which kind of brings us to the next question that I have is that, a lot of the book is fairly philosophical, actually, and thinking about what influences us as we do grow. And there's quite a bit about language, which was very interesting to me. I was a linguistics undergrad major and then teach English as a second language now. And so language is very interesting to me. And I have a lot of Chinese clients. So yeah, it gives me some insight into their situation. But one of the things you talk about with language is that it potentially limits how we think. So if your language has a word for something or doesn't have a word for something, that it might potentially lead you to have a different understanding of the world around us, which is, it's an interesting idea, right? I mean, I think linguists have been grappling with this idea for a long time. But there's sort of an implication that the more languages that we learn, then the more expansive our thoughts, right? That we can comprehend the world in more ways if we have access to more words about that world. And so I was wondering if you thought that was true. And then I was especially curious as a translator if you thought, that gives translators a little bit more insight into the world around us.
A lot of people, these days speak multiple languages, but not many people think too much about it. I think when I was writing this book, I want to make it a more conscious experience. So it might inform some people who wants to break the boundary of thinking by choosing a different tool. I think in Chinese, the language is still a very much pictographic language. So each character is composed of different radicals, and the radicals represent the shape of its meaning in nature. So, for example, the word mountain looks like mountain with 3 peaks, and the word water looks like water with the motion of waves. I think I explained a little bit in my book that how this pictographic trait of the Chinese language allows people to have a shared imagination and therefore a very close-knit community. On the other hand, I always wonder if your character of mountain looks like a mountain with 3 peaks. It is easy for people to imagine it with 4 peaks or, other shapes. So there is a limitation there. I think about this in terms of gender roles a lot as well. For example, the Chinese character man is composed of radicals field and strength. So a man means, yes, a person that is strong enough to work in the field. And the Chinese character married woman is composed of radicals a woman and a broom. So what does that say about the shared expectation of a married woman, right? Even the character good is composed of radicals daughter and son. So when I was in Hong Kong, people, like to congratulate mothers with both a son and a daughter making a good.
Oh, right.
Right. So I think, this is so deeply rooted in our thinking. And when I start analyzing it, I had a lot of aha moments, so I think English was my second language. I learned that since primary school. For me, it was a natural choice, when I wanted to have that option of thinking outside of the box. And yeah, for me, it was useful.
Oh, it's one of the things that's really enjoyable about the book is that often the chapters start with a word translated into Mandarin and then an explanation of the radicals. And it gives you a completely different insight into the word because of the images that are associated then with that word. So I was interested in those descriptions of the characters, how they're put together, what the different components mean. And then, as you say, kind of the value judgment sometimes that's included in those. But I was also curious about learning that kind of writing as a hobby or as a field of study. I think in several places you refer to it as calligraphy. And then
Mhm.
you talk about your protagonist as a girl that part of her homework or part of her education was filling pages with those characters, and that also her grandfather would draw them. And it made me start to
Mhm.
wonder, like, how much of this writing of Chinese characters is similar to the kind of activity that Americans might associate just with drawing, right? With doodling,
Mhm.
that's a relaxing thing to do. Or is it more like writing poetry, like you're creating a story in a way. So yeah, so tell me
Mhm.
about this writing of characters.
Right. I think calligraphy, I would say probably more like drawing. It is a mindful activity. So for me, it is a way to take those Chinese characters apart, to separate radicals from radicals, and to analyze the tools we use and to see their origins. The Chinese calligraphy, there are so many different styles, and
Right.
I think you writing the same character, you have so many different ways, and there are people famous for calligraphy. They write it in a certain way, whether it's with strength or with elegance. They're very different.
Oh.
So when I was thinking about calligraphy, I was reminded how the writing of it, like how you construct a stroke, is part of our expression. It's
Mm-hmm.
not just the word itself, but how we say it. So I feel like I was sort of filling this gap between, I have always been so attracted to reading, but there is some connection missing there. You know, uh, Even though I can talk to people in time and space, but there is something missing. And I cannot see their expressions when they're speaking at a moment. So it is my attempt to fill that gap and to really think about language, because language, whatever it is a imperfect vehicle.
For sure.
Yeah. Yeah, some say it only conveys 30% of our thoughts, and different languages, they freeze and frustrates in different ways,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's sort of like that Chinese saying, the blind people feeling the elephant.
You're right.
Yeah, so it's yeah, we touch the elephant in different parts because we speak different languages, and maybe in some way we're all approaching truth in different ways.
Yeah, it's interesting that by writing you can convey some of the sentiment behind it. As you say, how bold the stroke is, how much ink there is on the
Hmm.
pen, right? Which is something that we're able to do when we speak, right? Especially American English, where we have a lot
Hmm.
of expressiveness in the way we say a word, right? And we try to do it a little bit, I guess, in writing, but it does seem sort of pathetic, right? Like something might be bolded, right? Wow.
Hmm.
I mean, it
Right.
does something, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's pretty weak, really.
I think there's also an aspect of censorship in this because, throughout Chinese history, there's so many emperors, so many dictators, so many authoritarian leaders trying to silence opposing views in brutal ways. I think there is this fear, this seek for security in the language. So a lot of times people like to quote from the past intellect or from somebody in power because they don't feel safe having original thoughts.
Hmm.
For example, in Chinese, I think I mentioned in my book, the four-character 成语 is held, the ready language, the set phrase is held in high regard, and people don't think about using them as cliches, but as being more eloquent by quoting somebody, because they don't, feel so safe in talking about history. I think if you read books like The Life and Death in Shanghai by Nian Chen, you will see that there are scenes that the people in prison and the Red Guard in an argument are both quoting from Mao's Little Red Book,
Oh.
because that was the only safe phrases to use at a time. So I think there's always this undercurrent of self-censorship in the Chinese language. And, for me, sometimes that's why intellectuals, they would rather, practice calligraphy. They're writing the same thing over and over again, but they put their emotion in the way how they write it instead of, actually putting the words on the page.
Oh, yeah, that's really fascinating. Yeah, what an interesting idea, right? Sort of the not subversive so much, but the slant that you want to put on something is expressed in a slightly different medium, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
very interesting. And of course, Chinese poetry is really fascinating because of that, because it's often really subtle.
Mm-hmm.
It's a funny thing about being an English teacher because we do end up teaching cliches. You didn't use that word in your book, but that was the word, or I don't remember it being there. That was the word that kept coming to mind to me
Mm-hmm.
when you were talking in that section about people using set phrases over and over instead
Mm-hmm.
of creating their own idiom or metaphor or image. And it's
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I love about working with English learners is that they often come up with really interesting phrases, right, that I've never heard before, but are really creative and spot on, right? And instead, I'm having to teach, the same old cliches that we use all the time. But it's an interesting idea too. It reminds me a little bit about when people in American culture will say, "Well, the Bible says blah blah blah."
Mm.
And then that's taken as acceptable, right? That's something that we
Mm.
all agree on, even if we don't, right? That's the implication behind it.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested if this idea about, it's just a fascinating theme in your book, but you carry it a little bit further in the book. Also, and again, I'll quote from the book. Truth be told, I thought none of us shared the exact same memories about time and events, but many were willing to change their own memories to safely resemble a collective version or to reiterate them with a convenient collective language. And this definitely gets into this idea of self-censorship and maybe even censorship of your own thoughts, right? That you might corral your thoughts into a certain form because that's how other people say things or see things. And I was curious if you felt that that was particular to Chinese, or do you see that happening to Americans too? Or is this just part of being part of a society?
Well, I think it is part of being human. We don't want to be alone, and being original sometimes means being alone, and it's terrifying,
Mhm.
to a lot of people. Yeah, I was reminded these days, sometimes watching American news of this story in Chinese history, which later become a sad phrase, called 指鹿为马, calling a deer a horse. So that story originated from 200 BC. At the time, yeah, it's a very the first dynasty, Qing dynasty. There was a powerful eunuch at the time who was very favored by the emperor, but he has a lot of insecurity as well. So he wants to confirm his power among all the officials in the court. So one day he brings in a deer and he tells everybody, "Look at my beautiful horse." And most people were so afraid of him, said, "Oh, it is a horse." There were a couple of people said, "No, it's a deer." And of course, there were repercussions, and
Mhm.
they met a bitter end. They lost their lives. So this story becomes a very popular phrase, calling the deer a horse.
Mm.
But I think people likes to quote it when the same thing happens in history again, just by referring to it, and so that they want to show people they understand it. But I think sometimes this means no action is taken. So by just showing that we share this understanding, they're not trying to change anything.
Mm,
So the history keeps repeating itself, and
hmm.
people just keep repeating, quoting the same thing. I do see some similarity in America these days.
But as you say, yeah, I mean, being original is often makes you an outlier, especially if you're going against the consensus, right? And that can be quite punitive now with social media and so forth
Mhm.
when that gets revealed so that yeah, you're not conforming to what people's expectations are. It reminds me of the story of the emperor's new clothes, which is a story
Right.
that American children learn early. But again, it's interesting, as you say, it's more as though it's an observation of a phenomenon that everybody falls in line and
Mhm.
says, oh, yes, the emperor has beautiful clothes, even though the emperor has no clothes.
Mhm.
But it's not necessarily a call to action. It's just more, yeah, this is what people do, right? And as you say,
Mhm.
nothing changes. It's just an observation. But it does make me wonder, do you think that story has Chinese origins?
I don't think so. I think it's Anderson's story. Yeah, but
Yeah, yeah, it's
right.
interesting because yeah, now that you're talking about it, it's like yeah, there are definitely a lot of
Mhm.
parallels there.
Right, right.
I want to go back to this idea of loneliness because a
Mhm.
part of the book that is so memorable at the beginning is of the protagonist living in it, essentially an apartment building. It's a large house. She lives in this tiny apartment with a kitchen and a shower outside on the balcony. And she's kind of frenemies with Wei Wei, who's another little girl who lives the floor below. And your recounting of their interactions is just so perfect. It sounds so much like children of that age. You know, just, yeah, how they get along or don't get along and the fights that they have. But again, to quote from your book, and most of my generation, a generation of only children, grew up without speaking about or sharing history. We didn't feel safe enough to do so with someone outside our families. I only understood years later, following the trajectory of my peers, that loneliness was what we had most in common. And that's so touching, right? To think of these two girls, both only children, and how distanced they were from each other because of this societal situation that they found themselves in. And yeah, I wanted to ask you if you were particularly interested in writing about only children and what you effect you felt as though that might have had on their
Mhm.
upbringing.
Right. Only being an only child, it is something I thought very important to me. And we had so much expectations growing up, from our parents who just survived the Cultural Revolution. That high expectation to excel in school and later in life created a lot of competition among us and
Yeah.
a lot of isolation. And then on top of that, because of the traumatic events in Cultural Revolution, there was very much of a lack of trust in the Chinese society. And that was just recovering. It takes a long time to build that trust. And especially you live in a, authoritarian society, people are afraid sometimes to share history, even though the two families in my book, they share the same history. They both suffered because of the events. So I think what I always feel that in China, but maybe in elsewhere as well, people need to listen to each other and listen a little bit longer, not only just a glimpse of their story, but to listen to the whole story. Because I always believe if you dig deeper enough, everything will converge, right? Because essentially we share the same fear and desire as humans. Yeah, it is always, my desire to convey those nuances in humanity and find those common things we all have. I think that not only just applies to only children,
Mm.
To me, it applies to everybody because we all want that deeper connection, with people.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because the book, as I'm thinking about the book, the pivotal moments in the book are really based on her relationship, her relationships. So her
Hmm.
relationship with her friend in high school, really, her best friend for
Hmm.
a number of years, and then her relationship with a teacher, and then a
Hmm.
relationship with a an American-born Chinese young man.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting. Those characters are very interesting. They're very well filled out, the kind of character that if I saw them on the street, I would probably recognize them, right? They're
Hmm.
that complex. But you do feel the protagonist's desire to connect with them and her regret. Really, I would say for all three of those relationships, although, you tell me that maybe they weren't as explored as they could have been. Yeah, I feel as though that comes through in the novel. I don't know if that was your intention or not.
Hmm. I guess there is, because for example, I think I followed the best friend in the novel only up to their early 20s.
Yeah.
When they bonded over the canon in one of the Chinese classic novels, and
Mhm.
then they have their different interpretations about it.
Is
I
this the
think that,
red chamber?
right, yeah,
Okay.
Dream of the Red Chamber.
Yeah, explain that a little bit. Yeah, just for our
Mhm.
audience. Uh-huh.
Well, so this is one of the four Chinese classics, and one of my favorite books. I still enjoy reading it in different stages of my life. I think for a younger self of me, this book was so enlightening because it was actually an outlier in the Chinese novels up till the 20th century. So this book is about the downfall of a prominent family in Qing Dynasty in the 1700s, a doomed love story between two cousins. Both of them were very non-conforming, spirited, romantic types.
Mm.
Classic Chinese novels are like classic Chinese paintings. There's a lot of landscape, right? There's trees, mountains, clouds, but the human figures are very small,
Ah.
and they usually don't have much expressions on their faces because what they think is not really important. What's more important, to the art is they're in harmony with nature. They're part of this natural scene.
Mm.
So I feel that classic Chinese novels, that was the, first literature I started reading.
Mhm.
They really lingers in a single mind for long. But Dream of the Red Chamber is such a meticulous study of an individual soul,
Oh.
especially at odds with family, society, and tradition. Yeah, so that's why I think for me it has importance, and it's important to my characters in the novel as well. And that's the great thing about good novels. It allows so many different interpretations, by different types of people, because it captures the conflict in humanity so well. So I think for the other relationships, the teacher character, when I was writing it, I was thinking a lot about the aspect of language assimilation that happens in my childhood. In the 90s, the government was popularizing Mandarin,
Mhm.
often at a cost of diminishing local dialects. So in Shanghai, we grew up speaking Shanghainese, and I remember I was in middle school, most of my teacher was still teaching in Shanghainese. But
Mhm.
when I was in high school in the late 90s, the pushing of Mandarin was in full force. And my teachers came from different regions of China and they started mostly teaching in Mandarin. So I was hoping by creating this character, I can explore that curiosity and resistance to language assimilation because I was writing it during the height of Hong Kong protest. And I saw that this is what's going to come to Hong Kong as well.
Ah,
So I felt a lot of empathy for Hong Kong when I was looking back at my own childhood.
mm-hmm,
And I was hoping that this character can be read sort of allegorically, besides this physical relationship they had, which
mm-hmm,
is, of course, also very important. And I also sort of hoping that people will see beyond the political dichotomy that plagues many these days. You know, the teacher character who clearly doesn't have integrity in his personal life, but having an affair with his student is the same person who used to fight for democracy and essentially for the future of the next generation. Yeah, so I wanted to explore that complexity. I think Simon, the Chinese American character, to me, I think to me, he is the character maybe I didn't explore enough.
hmm,
I was just starting to think about him because he wants to learn more Chinese so that he can feel more grounded and having a better connection with his father because he is uprooted essentially from a culture he knows little about through his parents' decisions to migrate.
right.
I think, of course, the experiences of Chinese immigrants in the US and elsewhere are very uneven. And I think nowadays, younger immigrant parents, they make a more conscious effort to teach their children two or more languages. But I always feel something is always lost when you gain something else. Migration is such a multi-generational effort.
Mm-hmm,
In that process, I think everybody, the parents and their children, they have to make their own peace during this process. So I feel I'm just starting to explore that,
mm,
because I made a decision to migrate to the US. I have a 3-year-old daughter and she is going to grow up as an American.
yeah.
Yeah. So I was thinking about that when I was writing.
I think that would be a really fascinating topic for your next novel. Yeah, I
Right.
do. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's such a strange experience for me to be working with a Chinese client. I have lots of Chinese clients, and they're usually very well educated with excellent English. And I'm really working at the very highest level of English, to really perfect their English
Mhm.
or their accent or public speaking presentation, sort of professional development at that level. But, they're clearly still immigrants, right? English is clearly
Mhm.
still not their first language. And then every once in a while, their children will pop into the Zoom and they're totally American, right? They're just completely, and it's so disconcerting, right? To realize, wow, these people live in the same household together and yet they embody, very different cultures and backgrounds. So yeah, it's fascinating. I think immigration to the United States is just a fascinating topic. And just to mention here to my audience, the teacher is a really interesting character, right? And one of the conflicts that you convey so well is his ideological passion for things that have happened in his past, but his rather mundane treatment of his student. And that,
Mhm.
that again, that juxtaposition, that conflict is really interesting. Simon is a much more complicated character and really a
Mhm.
tragic figure in the novel. I don't want to give too much away to our readers, but yeah, that's one of the things that's very interesting, I think, about the novel is these particular characters that you present. Not to forget the best friend, who also has her own trajectory and is also a very interesting person. But yes, are you working on a novel now?
I'm just starting to think of my next project because my daughter is finally go to school,
Hmm.
for the full time this semester, and I'm starting to have a little bit mental space. So I think I do want to explore the theme of motherhood, because
Oh,
there's so much of emotion, so much to untangle during the past 3 years. And I'm eventually getting a little bit more distance. And,
Mhm.
I was so overly anxious over the past 3 years. I hope that little distance can turn into real perspective, of that psychological journey new parents take. And I'm also really interested in the aspect of Chinese folk tales.
Uh-huh.
So I grew up with my grandparents, just like my protagonist,
Mhm.
and they were very interested in listening to regional opera.
Right.
Those are often inspired by historical events, and those are some of the earliest stories I heard.
Hmm.
For example, in my book, I mentioned the story of Xi, who is a beautiful woman responsible for the downfall of two neighboring kingdoms.
Well, yeah, you make that clear in the book that, yeah, beautiful women are, yeah, are just trouble.
Right, right. There's this phrase, rosy complexion, disastrous water. So it's like beautiful woman, it's the flood, right? Yeah. And later, of course, you realize, women often are seen as scapegoats as, for the downfall of kingdoms. I think, in the West, you have the Helen figure as well. Even I think in Chinese history, up till, the end of Cultural Revolution, in our textbooks, we still read that the Gang of Four, Mao's wife, was responsible for it. It was not Mao, it was his wife,
Yeah,
right?
right. Okay. Yeah.
So, yeah, I think those early stories are influential. And I think there is another type of story, which, the story of Shishu, of course, those are serve the purpose of the ruling class. That's the kind of story they want to promote. But
Right.
there is also a different kind of story that with more fantastical elements, I would say usually. They express the desire of people in the face of tyranny or, the helplessness of life itself. For example, there's this ordinary woman character whose tears broke the Great Wall because her husband died
Oh,
building it for the emperor. And then there is this story of the white snake. The white snake taking the form of a woman. She married a scholar and she became a doctor, treating different difficult diseases. So those stories, I found they're worth exploring. I think a lot of Western writers and scholars, they are revisiting these classic,
mm,
folk tales and in the light of modern times. For example, gender roles. I remember when I was in university, I liked Angela Carter. She has these books of revising classical stories.
oh,
And lately, I have been reading to my toddler of some of the children's books are even have this revision aspect to it, like the Hansel and Gretel, the witch is actually a good witch, for example. And these are
uh-huh.
fascinating to me. And I find revisiting Chinese folk tales also very rewarding. And I'm starting to introduce some of these to my child. And I wish that that aspect will work their way into my next project as
Mm.
well.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of things that you're mentioning here, which I think would just, yeah, be really interesting to explore further in a novel. But the one that I'm thinking of also is language acquisition in children is often so interesting. Of course, they learn a lot from being read to, right? So they learn that kind of language, the fairy tale language, or in your case for your daughter, the folk tales, the Chinese folk tales. It'd be interesting to see those things
Mhm.
mingle, right, for her, these cross cultural things. But just in general, watching children learn how to talk and learn about language, I just think it's fascinating and often hilarious, right? That yeah,
Yes.
their understanding of how the language works often is very sensible. It's just not how it works. So,
Hmm.
yeah, that,
Hmm. Yeah.
kids say the darndest things. Yeah, is really quite true.
They're the most original, I would say.
Right, right. Well, it's been lovely talking to you. I don't want to keep you too long. But before I let you go, is there anything you'd like to share with the audience?
Sure. So it's really nice to be here. I enjoy the conversation, Jennifer. If your listeners want to connect with me, they can, do so through my website, floraqian.com, FLORAQIAN.com. I am on Goodreads, so feel free to follow me there. I also use Instagram. And my book, South of the Yangtze, is available on Amazon in both paperback and Kindle version. I hope you enjoy it.
Yes, and again, I'll just say again, I think it would make a great holiday present for somebody. Yeah, so hint about that. And yeah, thank you again, and good luck with the book and your forthcoming projects. And I hope I see you again on the podcast sometime.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you'd like to support us, we'd welcome your donation on Venmo or PayPal or whatnot. Links are in the show notes or on our website, Books, Shows, Tunes, all one word, .discreetguide, all one word.com, under the support tab. And hey, while you're there, drop us a line and tell us what you thought of the episode. We'd love to hear from you. Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts is brought to you by The Discreet Guide, a coaching and training company for improving your speaking and writing skills, with a special focus on mastering English, career advancement, and executive presence. Let's get you to where you want to go. Lastly, a shout out to Podomatic, our great podcast hosting platform, and to Quincas Moreira for the theme music.